Thank you so much, guys. Thank you. I'm thrilled to be here with everyone. I've been learning so much from all these tremendous speakers, and I just want to commend this organizing committee. Done such a great job pulling together all this content. The documentaries last night, the films were terrific. A great way to translate this information to the lay audience. So I'm really thrilled. I'm gonna just dive right in because we have a lot of material, and I know I'm keeping you from lunch, so I really want to get through this as quickly as possible. And I will be here till tomorrow, so if you guys have more questions, I'm so glad that Brad agreed to have one session on cannabis, and I'm hoping to shed some light for you on barriers to cannabis research and talk about our MAP study and things like that. So. I'm just going to jump right in just to tell you a little bit about my background. So we're probably best known for this FDA-approved clinical trial looking at whole plant cannabis, dry flower, in military veterans that have PTSD. But as Brad mentioned, I'm doing several other clinical trials now, looking at everything from cannabis for chronic pain to safety study on cannabis edibles. And these are my collaborators. You can see my main partner in all this has been LAPSS. They've stuck by me for over 10 years now as we've been navigating all these obstacles, and they've been just a wonderful partner. And as Brad mentioned, I'm a physician primarily, so I'm seeing patients full-time on telemedicine. I'm just a primary care doctor, internist. I'm based in Arizona. Just briefly want to tell you, I don't own anything in the cannabis space. I don't own dispensaries or grows, and I don't write certifications. I'm just really focused on the science. The first bullet was true for 46 years of my life. I was, proudly stating to everyone in Arizona that I'm a lifelong Republican that's never used cannabis. But last year I got diagnosed with breast cancer, and I ended up going through surgery and radiation, but I refused chemo, and instead I chose to use cannabis for the first time. And and this is one of my colleagues at University of Arizona who's doing studies on looking at, these are breast tumor cells in a petri dish, and he's infusing a synthetic cannabinoid, and you can see how dramatic the reduction in the density of breast tumor cells. So I thought this was really impressive that he's already documented. Here's another one of his studies looking at mice models with cancer, and you can see how the mice who received the synthetic cannabinoid had a much lower increase in the progression of the tumor size and less incidence of metastasis. So I was really determined to try this, and I've been using it successfully now for a year. And we launched this charity a few years ago called Doctors for Cannabis Regulation. So I wanted to mention this too, in case you know of physicians who are looking for kind of a safe place to talk about their beliefs about ending cannabis prohibition. That's what we're focused on, is trying to end, highlight the harms that have been done by criminalizing this plant and try to create a sanctuary for doctors to come together and talk about this. And that's why I try, in every lecture I give, I try to talk openly about my use of cannabis, because I believe that's the only way we'll ever be able to destigmatize this. If all of us, including professionals especially, if we can come out of the shadows and talk openly about our use, it'll start to mainstream this discussion. Many of you know this, I was a physician at the VA for a few years, then I was on faculty at the University of Arizona College of Medicine for 8 years in excellent standing until I became the principal investigator on this cannabis study, which put me at odds with the university administration that did not value this work, was overtly afraid of it. And ultimately, we were terminated after years of battling with them. Part of it was, I created this PAC when we had IRB approval from the university, and yet 2 years later, they still refused to find us a place to do the work, and we were fully funded with FDA approval, and they still rejected this. So we created this PAC, that is still actively trying to work on addressing barriers to cannabis research. But the good thing about being terminated was that it
it caused the media to shine a spotlight on barriers to cannabis research, and that was really helpful because we'd been battling the government for years in the shadows, trying to bring attention to this, and finally this really nailed it for us, where we had 2 years of free media coverage talking about the harms of the barriers to research. And we even had good people like Andy Weil and other luminaries coming out publicly condemning the university. And this was really courageous for him. At that time, he was still the department chair of integrative medicine at the U of A. So for him to come out so boldly, I was really psyched, and I was like, wow, this guy's a badass. He confronted the U of A president directly in the media, wrote an open letter to the media, and it was widely covered. But ultimately, we ended up in this private institute, Scottsdale Research Institute. We're happily independent from any university or hospital. So we're proving that you can do cannabis research, even controlled trials, without any assistance from a hospital or university. You just go through a private IRB, which is what we're using. And you can see right after we got terminated, we ended up scoring this $2 million grant from the state of Colorado. And this is really important because it was our first government grant to study the efficacy of cannabis. But the good thing about what Colorado did was they had $13 million surplus from their medical marijuana, their licensing fees and things like that. And they took 10 million of the 13 million and allocated it to these projects. So ours was the largest of the 9 projects. But the good news is you can see that you're going to be able to review data soon from all of these different studies that are underway. And I really applaud the state of Colorado because they insisted that they would only fund efficacy studies. They felt that the federal government was already doing a tremendous amount of work on safety studies, and that we didn't need to invest money into that. So the reason we're fighting so hard for this study is because it's the first and only controlled trial in the world looking at cannabis for PTSD. We have tons of other studies, like observational studies, case series, but the data is conflicting. Some of the data shows cannabis may be helpful for PTSD, and other observational studies show it could be detrimental. So that's why it was so important to us to have a definitive study on this. And after 7 years of struggle with the government, we finally got this. The scientists call this the golden ticket. It's the DEA Schedule I license. And this is the document that allows you to purchase cannabis from the federal government. It gives you the privilege. And I would say as soon as I got this, we moved to order 8 kilos of cannabis from the DEA, from the NIDA Monopoly. And you would think 8 kilos surely would come by like armored truck or something, but here's the FedEx guy delivering. He had no idea he was even transporting cannabis. He was so stunned why all the cameras were there. But when you pull it out, it comes in a cooler that's frozen. It's been sitting in the lockers of the DEA, this RTI company, for years. And it's frozen. It arrives frozen in these sandwich bags that are labeled with the different ratios of THC to CBD. And then we're required to pour it out and weigh it for the DEA drug accountability logs. And you can see it's like a green powder. It's very bizarre consistency. Doesn't really resemble real world cannabis. And that was part of all of our concern was that, is this really cannabis? How do we reassure patients in the study that this is indeed cannabis? We don't even get a drug master file from the FDA or NIDA, so we don't know what it is. This is actually the placebo, so it looks similar to the other batches. It's just the same cannabis plant material, alcohol washed. They leach out all the cannabinoids and terpenes, so it's just inert plant material. But this is really discouraging, though. And you can imagine to fight so many years to end up with the quality of study drug. And that's why I wanted to highlight this for you guys, because I think it's important for all of us as taxpayers to be aware that $68 million every 5 years goes to perpetuating this monopoly. And all of us should be concerned that this is probably sabotaging the results of efficacy studies. I'm going to talk to you about that more. But because we were concerned, about how to explain to patients that this is cannabis, we moved to do testing. We were the first group of scientists to ever do independent testing through a DEA Schedule I lab that was independent of our lab. And remember, DEA doesn't tell you who has a Schedule I license. It's confidential. So I spent months cold calling labs all over the country till we finally found a lab that was able to do this, and they found excessively high levels of mold and lead in all the batches. And then you have this dilemma as a physician: how do I knowingly hand out moldy cannabis to our revered military veterans? It just seemed like a really impossible situation. But ultimately, we move forward just putting in the informed consent that, hey, this is natural plant material that is contaminated with all kinds of things, and we made a list of what's in there so that they understand that that this is what they're getting into. But interestingly, when that article came out on PBS NewsHour, all these other articles were spawned from this. It just went viral right away, and I think what it showed was that, it confirmed people's suspicions about the quality of the federal government cannabis. But sadly, as a result of us going public with this data, we ended up losing our partners at Hopkins. The next day after that article went viral, Johns Hopkins resigned. We got a letter from their lawyers saying they're resigning. And that wasn't a surprise to us. They had really resisted our efforts to test it. They didn't understand why we were even doing independent testing. They said, the government has already told you what's in it. Why would you question the government? They said, we're scientists. I mean, isn't that our duty? Where is the intellectual curiosity here? So we were proud of the fact that we did this, and we published a summary of, we ended up doing 3 rounds of testing from different labs and summarized our findings on the MAPS website. If you ever want to see that report, let me know and I'll shoot it over to you. I want to just jump to, many of you probably have not seen cannabis, how a clinical trial is done, especially a controlled trial. So I'm just going to slide over. Show you, oops, sorry about that. Try that here, let's see. Okay, let me see if this works. Yeah, so I'm gonna just give you an overview of the study design, just so you can, since we don't have data yet, I'll just tell you what we're doing and talk about, give you an update, because I know many of you have been following this saga for many years. So this is an FDA phase 2 trial. So it's an early phase drug development trial. It's an exploratory study, really, to prepare us for FDA phase 3. And what we're looking at 76 patients. That's not right. It says multi-site study. No longer. It's all being done in Phoenix now. And let me just show you it is a triple blind study. And I know all of you know double blind, but many of you probably aren't aware what triple blind means. It basically means everybody's blinded. So the veterans who are receiving the study drug have no idea what phenotype, what ratios they're getting. Of course, all the investigators have none of the staff, and then the independent raters also are blinded to what anybody's on. So we just have one unblinded lab technician who does all of the randomization and administration of the study drug. But here you can see basically what you get from the federal government is just the ratio of THC to CBD. You have no idea what else is in it. And so here's what we ended up with from NIDA. We ended up, there's 4 arms of study. The first arm is high THC, which typically the federal government doesn't produce anything beyond like 9 to 10%. They reported ours as 12%, but our testing showed 9%. We have a high CBD arm. which is mostly CBD with under 1% other cannabinoids, and then a 1-to-1 ratio of THC to CBD. We actually asked for 12%, and we ended up with this kind of 8-ish percent. And then, of course, the placebo. And just so you have a sense of how the timeline works. So the first step is familiarizing the patients with the study drug. The veterans go into what we call an introductory session where they're required to sit for 4 hours in our lab, and we observe them after they've used the drug to make sure that they're tolerating it, not having any bad side effects. And this was really the sticking point with the universities. This was the problem that they had with this, that they didn't like the optics of veterans smoking weed on their campus. And so that's why most of them rejected this. All of them actually rejected this study, even a fully funded FDA-approved study. So, so we ended up, that's why, and it took us forever to just find a lab in the private sector. I mean, a building that would house this work, because you can imagine the zoning issues around people smoking cannabis on site. It's very complicated. We were zoned out of existence from pretty much everywhere, but we finally ended up in this warehouse. And, you know, so what happens is these patients, I thought this would actually be overkill. I thought this is really, these intro sessions, 4 hours seems really over the top. But in fact, these intro sessions have been really valuable. We're getting a lot of good data about, you know, how their vital signs changed during smoking, after smoking. We're monitoring the quality of their experience, how they're reacting to the study drug, good, you know, pleasant and unpleasant drug experiences. And we've had some patients have some really significant side effects, and I attribute that to the quality of the study drug. Honestly, if you, when we have regular, you know, experienced cannabis users who are exposed to high THC cannabis all the time, and they come into our study and they take 2 puffs of cannabis in an intro session and report 10 hours of unpleasant high after, there's something wrong with the study drug. And that's why I'm gonna talk to you about that a little bit more. So after they've done their intro session, they do 2 back-to-back on 2 consecutive days, then they're invited to move into stage 1. So they take whatever drug, whatever batch they've been assigned. Let's just say they're on high THC. They take that home with them for 3 straight weeks, and they utilize the cannabis at home. This is a method that was very, we received a lot of opposition from the FDA about this patient self-titration model, but we fought hard for this because we really believe, especially with any botanical medicine, you gotta let patients use, you know, start with the lowest amount and go up slowly. And if we force people into fixed dosing like what the FDA wanted, that it would have caused a lot more adverse events. And so we're really glad that the FDA came along with us and finally approved this model. But so basically, they're using the cannabis whenever they feel like it. There's no dosing. They may skip days. You know, they're targeting their PTSD symptoms. So some days they may have good days where they don't need any. I'll tell you, most of the vets we give them up to almost 2 grams a day. And most of the vets use far less than that. Matthew is here, our intern in the lab, and he weighs the study drug each week when it comes back in. The patients are required to return their unused marijuana each week so we can weigh each of the canisters for each day. And a lot of these guys have used, you know, under a half a gram. And maybe, again, that may be partly because of the quality of the study drug, but also because the truth is that these guys often need very little to manage their symptoms. So they get through those 3 weeks, and then they're cut off the study drug for 2 weeks. There's a 2-week abstinence period in between the crossover part of the study. And then they go to stage 2, where they're re-randomized into a brand new batch of cannabis. So if they were on high THC in stage 1, they may be on high CBD in stage 2. The good news is there's no placebo in stage 2. So if they were on placebo in stage 1, they're guaranteed not to get that. They're guaranteed some active study drug during the study. And it's the same model in stage 2, 3 weeks of home self-titration, and then another 2 weeks of abstinence, and then we have this optional stage 3 that we added to try to, we any of the unused cannabis that they brought back, they're allowed to use that during stage 3. That was our incentive to get people to bring back their cannabis, but it really isn't necessary. The vets have been really good about being compliant. And I just want to give you a sense of, why these studies are so expensive. Like, why does it cost over $2 million to do this, what seems like a really simple trial? It's all about all these secondary measures, right? Our primary outcome measure is the CAPS, of course. The CAPS scale is probably it's the gold standard for measuring PTSD, but we have all these secondary measures. They're wearing actigraphy watches, so we're measuring their sleep architecture each night and how the cannabis affects that. We're drawing blood, measuring biomarkers for inflammation, something that all of us are curious about. We all hear that cannabis has such profound anti-inflammatory capacity, but it's never really been quantified, so we're measuring all kinds of biomarkers, IL-6, IL-17, things like that. And then there's just tons of monitoring. I don't want to get too far into this because I know we got to move on, but I just want to mention the recruitment has probably been one of the most difficult aspects of this, finding veterans who are willing to make the sacrifice. It's a rigorous, about 3-month process for them. And our recruitment, I would say our guerrilla PR tactics are everything short of skywriting. Like I've been taking flyers to strip joints and gun shows and wherever I can find vets and just begging them to do this. And it's been really successful. We've had over 6,000 inquiries over 2.5 years. And the update on this study is that we are now up to, we just enrolled our 65th patient in the study, 65 out of 76. So we are in good position to complete this study on time. The goal was and the budget was designed to end the trial at the end of 2018, and we're on track to do that. So if you know any veterans who are in the Phoenix area who want to offer themselves for the study, we only have about 10-ish slots left by the end of October. They have to be screened. So now I'm going to jump, and I just want to mention too that this study is a good mix of vets who are naive to cannabis and those who are experienced. So all we ask is that if you're using cannabis currently, that you have to wash off the cannabis for 2 weeks before starting the study, and you're not allowed to use any of your own cannabis, but that's how we tried to create sort of a level playing field, so everybody comes in cannabis free at the beginning, and it's really helped. A lot of these guys who use regularly have found that the break they get kind of resensitizes their receptors, and it's been helpful. So now I want to just end with this discussion about barriers to research. So make sure you guys are armed with all the important information about how the government is harming this research. And I want to just point out that many of you probably aren't aware that it is harder to study cannabis than any other drug in Schedule 1. So all the other psychedelics, heroin, all that is easier to manage and to get through the regulatory hurdles than cannabis is. And that seems bizarre since cannabis is so, has such low toxicity. But this is really all about federal government overreach. Here you can see when you want to study any controlled drug in the country, you've got to go through these 3 agencies: FDA, the IRB committee, and the DEA. We're not arguing, we're not disputing that makes sense. But the issue is that when you look at cannabis head to head with, say, heroin or any other drug in Schedule 1, you see that cannabis has had 2 additional layers of government red tape for many decades now that we've had to endure in order to get these studies underway. And you can see the Public Health Service review and the NIDA Monopoly are the things that have been blocking cannabis trials for years. The PHS review is a redundant review that occurred after we already had FDA approval. We had to get an additional, review from these folks who really don't have expertise in cannabis research. It took us 3 years to get through that process. They didn't require any protocol changes at the end of that, nothing. And it's just designed specifically to stymie this work. The only reason we finally got our approval out, in my opinion, is because CNN, Sanjay Gupta, if you watch Weed 3, it's all about our a soap opera trying to get this study through the regulatory process. And when that aired on CNN and kept re-airing, 2 days later, I had my approval letter from Public Health Service. But sadly, during that time, 24,000 veterans killed themselves in this country. And we keep wondering if we had this data, that would have helped curb this epidemic of veteran suicide that we're seeing. The good news, though, was after we fought so hard to get this, we were able to spend the next year lobbying the government, showing our experience with this PHS review, and managed to get the Obama administration to end that review after so many decades of this blocking our work. And so I really credit MAPSS. They could have just taken that letter and just moved forward and said, all right, we're good. But their commitment was to clear the path for other scientists coming after us and make sure that other researchers wouldn't have to deal with this awful experience. So this is a little bit old, but the point of this was to say that this DEA monopoly, here we've got all the approvals, all the funding, but we still couldn't move forward for another couple of years after that, was because of this. The NIDA monopoly is actually, NIDA, the National Institute on Drug Abuse, has enjoyed a government-enforced monopoly on cannabis research, on the only federally legal drug supply for cannabis research since 1968. They have held this monopoly. And as I mentioned to you, they get $68 million every 5 years through this NIH grant to perpetuate what we would argue is an incompetent monopoly. This is Dr. El Soli, who's a good guy. I sit on committees with him, but unfortunately he is the head of this facility where they are taking the plant, throwing it into a grinder from root to tip, and there he has his hand in a barrel of this ground up cannabis, which then gets rolled up into cigarettes that get shipped out to scientists all over the country. So I want to emphasize, I don't want you to get the impression there's no cannabis research happening in the US. There's tons of studies. You can go on clinicaltrials.gov and you just put in cannabis or marijuana, you'll see dozens and dozens of active trials that are enrolling. But if you look closely at them, you'll notice that most of them are safety studies, looking at harmful side effects of cannabis or addiction potential of cannabis, not the efficacy trials that we so desperately need. And when scientists dumped out these cigarettes, you see that this was the result. This is Ethan Rousseau. Many of you guys know him. Stems, sticks, leaves, seeds, a lot of extraneous plant material. So I feel like what happened was they then moved to grind this into a powder because they were so mad that scientists were sharing pictures of this, and they said, "I can't have that." So they grind it into a powder so you can't even discern what's the extraneous plant material, what's the flower. But wouldn't it be nice in the US to someday have a drug supply that's just flower from one strain, one phenotype? That would be the ideal, and I think that's the picture. This is what we'd like to use, but what we're forced to use is that other material, and someday we'll get there. But this is important for you to be aware that other countries do not have a monopoly like this, right? So there's tons of examples of Canada, Israel, Czech Republic, all provide licenses for folks to grow for research. And so we're one of the few that continues to have this monopoly. I've mentioned the inadequacy of the supply, the fact that I can't get any unique phenotypes. If I dare ask for something, let's say that's rich in THCV or CBN or CBG, you're not going to be able to get that from this monopoly. And so that's the hard thing, is as we get more sophisticated in our understanding of cannabis, we need to be able to access these the unique phenotypes. And the other thing is that even though they're receiving all this taxpayer money, they refuse to turn over their drug master file. That's something we've vigorously objected to, the fact that they refuse. They share it with the FDA, but they will not give it to the very scientists that are handing this drug out to patients. So I feel like this is so basic. When getting a drug master file should be a required step for any clinical trial, but they don't have to turn it over. They keep claiming that the reason they're allowed to keep this monopoly is because of this international treaty. But MAPSS, you might have remembered about 10 years ago, MAPSS sued the DEA and won, and they were able to prove that this international treaty argument is bogus. The judge agreed that that was a bogus argument. So I want to also mention we do have some unlikely allies that are coming forward, pointing out the problem here, like Nora Volkow, who's been the chief cannabis prohibitionist in the country. She's been very anti-cannabis most of her career. She's admitted, though, that her monopoly is harming cannabis research. And this was her testimony at a US Senate hearing last year where she admitted that it is a barrier. They asked, does this exist for any other drug in Schedule 1? No, it does not. This cannabis is the only one that has this monopoly. When we want to do a study on MDMA or LSD, we go buy research grade MDMA from any lab in the country or outside the country. We don't have to go through the NIDA monopoly. So this is just an absurd, it's a clear strategy the government has implemented to impede this kind of research. And it's really disheartening. And this is the language of the Controlled Substances Act. I want to just make sure that you're armed with this exact language. It says that the NIDA monopoly will provide an adequate and uninterrupted supply of cannabis for these controlled trials. And we would argue they've never done that. They've never met that criteria. It's taken 20 months for us to get our cannabis, and then we didn't get any of the phenotypes that we requested. So I would say that this monopoly is a failure. And so let me just end with this. This is the FDA, it requires that phase 3 trials have to be done, that whatever is the drug that you use in phase 3 is the drug you have to go to market with. And so I want to make sure that I feel like this is the big untold story in the cannabis movement is we have the medical community demanding that they will not view cannabis as a medicine until it's put through the entire FDA drug development process. I get it. So that's what we're trying to do, right? This study we're doing is an FDA phase 2 trial. When the data is in from that, we will be petitioning the FDA to go to phase 3, but we don't have a study drug for phase 3. Because NIDA cannabis is not allowed to be used for phase 3. It's only allowed for academic research. So FDA phase 1 and phase 2, but not for phase 3. So that's a big issue that we have, that we'll be ready to go to phase 3 in 2019, but we won't have a federally legal drug supply because the DEA refuses to make good on their pledge. Remember, many of you saw 2 years ago, the DEA announced that they were finally going to end the monopoly and license other growers for research. It was a huge celebration among MAPSS. They thought they finally had, had broken the monopoly, but in fact, the DEA never put a timeline on that. And we all know when the DEA makes an announcement without a timeline that it's probably not going to happen. And that's what we're seeing now. 2 years later, they still haven't followed through on that pledge. We still don't have a drug supply. Many of us have moved to apply for that schedule. So as soon as the DEA announced that they would be licensing other growers, MAPSS put in a Form 225. We put in one from Scottsdale Research Institute. We've helped a dozen other applicants try to put in their own applications because we don't care who we just want to see the monopoly ended. But sadly, the DEA took our $3,400 application fee and refused to process the application. So everybody's in limbo. And so now I'm just going to end it with this. I want to show you guys. So what they're doing now is forcing us to go source study drug from foreign countries. And so this is why I ended up in China a few months ago trying to identify a drug supply that was GMP grade. That's the problem, is you can't just buy cannabis from any other country. They have to be able to prove to the FDA they have GMP grade cannabis, and there's only a couple countries that are at that level. But you can see here, I went through teaching the faculty. There's 2,000 medical schools, 2,000 universities in China, and many of them are actively engaged in cannabis research. So it was really fascinating to work with these students, and they unfortunately tried to make me eat this, which was terrifying. So we had bamboo worms and bee larvae, but I mean, their research is, oh, sorry, I'm a little bit ahead of myself. The research is so sophisticated there, and you can see here what they're doing is they're growing massive amounts of industrial hemp in the Yunnan province, miles and miles of really unique phenotypes. And you can see they have a really slick automated process, giant factory with processing. You know, they're extracting cannabinoids in massive quantities. You know, like they have a extraction room as big as this place that is just all custom extraction equipment, and they're putting tonnage quantities of hemp in there and extracting all the cannabinoids except THC. So what they do with the THC is destroy it right away, but they do allow THCV, CBN, all the other cannabinoids. So what you're seeing there is like a pure 99% pure CBD, water-soluble CBD crystals, and we'll probably be trying to use this for a future study because I don't have any other drug supply. And so I think that's really, we should all be concerned about this as US citizens, why we can't allow our own farmers to grow, all these expert farmers who could be doing this work for our own controlled trials. Why is the government continuing to impede this and allowing me instead to go and import study drug from foreign countries? It makes no sense. And so I'm hoping that by sharing this with all of you that what we can create, just by being informed, can create kind of a groundswell of support to end the monopoly, to keep the pressure on the DEA and particularly DOJ, right? Jeff Sessions is intimately involved in blocking the DEA from issuing these licenses. So that's where the pressure, where our attention needs to be focused. And I just want to end it. I love dogs, so I had to throw this up there. I just gotta thank our vets. I mean, I swear, without these veterans, we would not have this study implemented. So I thank all the vets who've inquired about the study, who've gone through the 60 plus vets who've actually completed the protocol, but all the vets in this country who've served our nation and just been so supportive, helping us kick down the doors of the government to get this study underway. I thank all of you, and I appreciate everybody in the audience. And I'm not sure, Brad, if we can even take questions. I really want you guys to be able to eat, so I'll leave it up to you if you wanna. To you guys. Oh, thank you.
We have plenty of time for questions.
Guys very much.
So you mentioned that they destroy the THC, and that's where you may be getting for phase 3. So I'm curious where you would get the THC from, because that's a critical component.
You're right. Yeah, we don't have a solution yet. So if anybody knows a place that has GMP grade THC in a foreign country, I'm entertaining all ideas at this point. But yeah, it's a good one. We definitely want. I mean, we don't have data yet. Since we're all blinded, I don't know what the results have been, but we're suspecting that certainly we want a batch with high THC in our phase 3 trial for sure, and probably several different batches, different phenotypes.
Hi there. I really applaud your perseverance in the face of this government obstruction. One of the questions I was really curious about is there any preliminary data on the efficacy of the smoked cannabis for PTSD symptoms?
That's the problem. Yeah, that's what I was trying to say is because it's triple blind, I can't even make any conclusions yet. But we will be finishing, probably the last vets will complete the trial in January, February. So we hope to unblind all the data in March of next year, and then we'll be publishing all of it. The good and the bad camps will all be put into the public domain for everyone to scrutinize. So, good question, thank you.
Hi, one thing I thought you said that was interesting was what you said about China immediately destroying the THC made me wonder, do you think that China, as a traditionally very conservative country, is coming at cannabis research with a specific agenda?
It didn't even dawn on me. It could be, they're doing it under the guise of protecting public safety, and it's very strict. I mean, if you're caught with THC, it's a capital offense there. So, I mean, it's pretty awful. So, I'm not sure, but that's a good question. I will continue to ask around about that to see if I can get any intel on that, but it's a really interesting thinking you have there.
Given the fact that you tested this government-grade cannabis and found mold and lead, leads me to doubt some of the results from past studies, safety studies. And do you have any evidence to show that some of these safety studies actually may be inflating some of the harms, or the harms may not be due to cannabis or cannabinoids?
I think that is a really important theory, that we don't have proof that the government is deliberately trying to sabotage, but it certainly is common sense tells you. Look at this trajectory of the way we've treated cannabis research and the way we've protected this DEA monopoly for so many decades, and you have to. That's the conclusion I think all of us come to, is of course they're deliberately doing this to try to, the veterans say it's like trying to make a 3 Michelin star meal using Vienna sausages as your starter material. It's just really harmful. And the thing that I always wondered about was, I was always curious, when I just started, I really got into cannabis research about 10 years ago, and when I started examining the scientific literature, I was just amazed, because the reason I got interested was because all the veterans were coming into my medical practice claiming they were getting benefit, and I was very skeptical at that time, and I was kind of rolling my eyes, but then when I looked at the data, it did show that cannabis had some benefit for different conditions, but it wasn't close to what the patients were reporting, right? The patients are describing these transformative experiences where it's been life-changing, life-saving for many of them, and yet the control trials never showed. They would show some efficacy, but it was always really anemic. And that's when I realized, of course, when you look at the quality of the study drug, and I'm even seeing it in our study now, the responses we're observing, we're getting some good responses from patients. And we have some patients who don't even have detectable PTSD at the primary endpoint, so it's been really surprising. So this will be incredible if we can show efficacy with this really low quality plant material. I think we can make an argument to extrapolate from there to what real world cannabis would have performed like in that study. So yeah, it's a really good point.
Hi. Have you had any patients experience cannabis hyperemesis syndrome? And if so, do you think it's related to pesticides, mold, and cannabis?
That's such an important question. I wish I knew. I think that's the big mystery that everybody's trying to understand. I definitely had patients who've had he's talking about cannabis hyperemesis syndrome, where they get the cyclical vomiting. Usually we think it's from high THC strains, but nobody really knows. And the treatment in the ER, when they end up in the emergency room, they give them hot showers, and it tends to subside pretty quickly. But we don't have any clear insight into how this is happening, and they try to create a ton of drama around it. So every new legal state, they say, the cases of cyclical hyperemesis have gone up 200% in the ER, and it means that they had 3 cases that went to, 3 cases that went to 9. And so they, but it's really not an epidemic, but it is a concern, and it's very disabling when people get it. So we do need to understand it. So I appreciate you asking.
Okay, I guess that's it. So thank you very much.